Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of History. So today we're going back just 159 years ago, and that is around the years of the American Civil War. I came to choose this topic because we are in the process, few weeks away of choosing our next president of the United States, and apparently everybody mentions that apparently to each election, they will say that it's the most important election of our lifetime. Well, apparently, it looks like this one really is. So I wanted to go to the secession war and the war between the North, the Union, and the Confederate South. And it's something that really strike me as a conflict where a people, a nation of the United States of America found themselves torn apart on particular issue. You might say, well, the secession wars happened because of slavery. However, it's far more difficult to address than that because, as you know, history is made out of different occurrences, it's never black or white. There is always something else. It's more complicated than we're taught to believe. Therefore, when we want to reach quick conclusions, we might quickly dismiss everything else and say, well, this is the real reason why this thing happened. But it's not that cut and dry. There have been different events that surrounded the decisions and the events leading up to the secession war. And I'm talking about civil war because nowadays our country is not that we face the same problems or the same issues, but we're at a point where half of our nation, of our 331 million people, is kind of torn in this issue where 50% of the population is for one side and 50% is from another side. And it looks like the differences are irreconcilable and that we find ourselves separated and torn apart by different political ideologies. But we always forget that we're still one people. We are the United States of America. So I just wanted to shed some light in the events that brought up to the secession back then, because to a certain extent, even if we're not in that dire situation, we're the modern world today, 2024, we're talking about 1861, 1860s, 19th century, everything was different back then. And personalities and events were way different than they are today. We were still a young country back then, trying to figure out who we were. And I thought that event in history made us stronger in who we are today. Is that going to be true for the future? Well, we do not know. We'll see how the next few weeks will unfold in our modern history and shape our future. Stick along throughout the whole lesson if you want, if you can, or if you just want to listen to it without looking at the video, look at my boy face. But we'll just you'll just find out many little details that probably you haven't studied in school and you didn't know. And for me, as an outsider living in the United States only for 14 years so far, has been a great lesson and a great revelation, because there were many things that I did not know, and I was really thrilled to learn. And I really hope that I can shed some more light into your knowledge and give you maybe a different point of view about the secession war, the North against the South. So imagine being in Washington on April 14th, 1865, just 5 days after the Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox. It's really difficult to spell this word because it's of native origin. And this signaled the end of the American Civil War, that period. The country is finally beginning to hope for peace after years of devastating conflict. And President Lincoln, looking for a brief respite from the weight of leading a divided nation, attends a play at Ford's Theater. The mood in the city is one of cautious relief, but one would never expect the dark turn the night will take. During the performance, John Wilkes Booth, one of America's most famous actors, enters the theater. Booth is a regular here, so no one stops or questions him. And at just 27-year-old, he is celebrated for his striking looks and immense talent on the stage. And he's often hailed as the most handsome man in America at the time. Newspapers have praised him and his performances for years, in a time where the theater was the dominant form of entertainment back then. Booth is a household name, but behind this charming exterior lies a deep, deep hatred for President Lincoln, a fervent supporter of the South, which had just lost the war, that is, Booth. So Booth blames the president for the Confederacy's defeat and the ruin of the Southern way of life. On this fateful night, Booth uses his fame and familiarity with the theater to approach Lincoln's private box unnoticed. Security is lax, and these are different times. No one expects a tragedy. Once inside, Booth pulls out a small pistol and fires a shot into the back of the president's head. At that moment, chaos erupts. An officer, Major Henry Rathbone, attempts to stop Booth, but the actor slashes him with a dagger and leaps to the stage, injuring his leg in the process. As Booth flees, he shouts words that he believes will cement him in history as a hero. Sic semper tyrannis, thus always to the tyrants. This echoing Brutus after the assassination of Julius Caesar. It is the motto of Virginia, and is often used to suggest that tyrannical leaders will be eventually overthrown. So Booth escapes into the night, convinced that he was struck a blow to the South, for the South. But instead of becoming a hero, he is hunted down like a criminal just 2 weeks later. So Booth is killed in a shootout with the cavalry as he tries to evade capture. President Lincoln, the first U.S. president to be assassinated, and he dies the next morning, throwing the nation into mourning. Lincoln's assassination marks a tragic turn point for the country. The war that claimed over 600,000 lives has ended, but his death casts a long shadow over the fragile peace. The assassination sets a grim precedent over the years. 3 other U.S. presidents like James Garfield, William McKinley, and John F. Kennedy will also meet violent ends while in office. But Lincoln's death in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War remains one of the most shocking and pivotal moments in the nation's story, the nation's history. In other words, the American Civil War resulted in more deaths than all the wars in the United States fought in the 20th century combined, and the conflict was triggered by the election of Abraham Lincoln as president in November of 1860. Lincoln was the Republican candidate, and he was elected with just 40% of the popular vote, a relative majority. At the time, the political landscape was quite different from today. It wasn't just 2 main candidates competing for the presidency. In the 1860 election, there were 4 major candidates which split the vote. Lincoln won the relative majority in the North, but in most of the southern slave states, he didn't receive a single vote. The country was deeply divided over the issue of slavery, and his victory was seen as a threat to the Southern way of life. This division was so severe that it set the stage for the secession of the southern states at the beginning of the Civil War. When one studies the origins of the American Civil War, it becomes clear that a nation doesn't fall into civil war merely due to a divided public opinion or widespread discontent. The Civil War in the 19th century America erupted because the country was split between 2 fundamentally different models of development, economy and society. These models were geographically rooted, with the North and the South representing opposite visions for the future. In the South, the economy was built on slavery and agriculture, while the North increasingly embraced industrialization and wage labor. These divisions weren't just popular sentiments, they were also the beliefs of politicians, intellectuals, wealthy elites, and ideologues on both sides. So, what was it in the 19th century that divided the United States so profoundly that it led to a civil war? And what were the United States like in the mid 1800s? Well, in 1860s, in the 1860s, the US had a population of 31 million, while today we have a population of approximately 331 million. And that number may seem small in the mid 19th century, but it was significant. The US had more inhabitants than Great Britain and only slightly fewer than France, two of the world's leading powers that already had vast colonial empires. This demographic strength indicated that the United States was already on its way to becoming a potential global power. What is particularly amazing is that in the 1860s, the United States had grown from just 23 million inhabitants only 10 years earlier. This means that in just one decade, the population increased by 1/3, so that it was an explosive growth. The country was experiencing tremendous growth fueled by waves of immigrants and the massive industrial expansion. In the mid-19th century was a time of explosive industrial growth, leading nations like Great Britain, Germany, France, and the United States. So during the 1850s and 60s, the value of industrial production in the United States doubled, reflecting this rapid transformation and laying the groundwork for the country's future and economic power. When we examine these figures, it's worth taking a moment to reflect. For example, today we deal with annual growth rates of 0.5% or single percentage points, but back then we're talking about a doubling of production in just 10 years. And at the time, the United States was still predominantly rural, with more farmers than city dwellers, though that shift was already on the horizon. In 1860, the United States had 53,000 kilometers of functioning railways, with more under construction. And in comparison, my birth country, Italy, had only 1,800 kilometers of railway at that time. Of course, we're talking about different territorial expanse. Therefore, the comparison cannot really be there. But just to give you an idea. Moreover, the United States was a unique society in the world, being a democracy with universal suffrage, something that did not exist in any other European country. But we wanted to clarify universal suffrage. What does that mean? Well, as they understood it, it meant only for men, but a growing women's movement was already advocating for equal rights and the right to vote. The only significant inequalities were economic. While today the US is known for having one of the largest wealth gaps between the super rich and the poor among Western nations, the US of the mid-19th century was the most egalitarian country in the world, with smaller income disparities compared to other nations. Of course, you had the super rich, but moreover, overall it was a very mild difference in the wage gap. Wages in the United States were much higher than in Europe, which explains the wave of immigrants coming from countries like Germany, Poland, and Italy. Literacy rates were also remarkably high in the US, with 90% of the white population able to read and write and routinely read newspapers. This overall picture applies to the entire country, but only to a certain extent. Well, the ideals of democracy, egalitarianism, and literacy were true throughout the nation, although they were perhaps more pronounced in the North than in the South. The immense industrial growth with immigration and the constant transformation were typical of the North alone, While the North held three-quarters of the population, it also contained almost all the factories and the industrial workers. The South, on the other hand, was wealthy by entirely agricultural, with its wealth rooted in plantations and slavery. At the time, there were about 4 million slaves in the South, representing a significant amount of capital. On paper, this made the South incredibly rich, largely due to the profits from cotton, which had become the region's primary crop. While there was still some tobacco farming in Virginia, cotton completely dominated the Southern economy. A century earlier, the South had been known for producing tobacco, sugar, and rice. However, by 1860 had transformed into the land of cotton, largely driven by the Industrial Revolution in England. The cotton mills of Manchester consumed vast amounts of cotton each year, supplied mainly by the southern states, which were sustained by the investments in those 4 million slaves and the immense profits generated from cotton. Although the South was wealthy, its economy had stagnated, failing to grow or transform. And this was a stark contrast compared to the North that was undergoing a profound change. Despite its agricultural focus, the South had maintained political dominance over the United States until the mid-19th century. The elite class of large plantation owners significantly influenced the country's politics, and Abraham Lincoln was the 16th president. Among the 15 presidents who preceded him, 9 were from southern states, and 8 were slave owners. In fact, more than half of the U.S. presidents before Lincoln had personally owned slaves. Even those from the North often gained election through political agreements with southern plantation owners. No president had ever actively opposed the interests of the South. This political control can be understood by recognizing that the United States wasn't just divided into 2 regions. It was actually divided into 3, which included the West. The North, with its roots in Puritan New England, particularly Connecticut and Massachusetts, along with the bustling metropolis of New York, was characterized by commerce, industry, and rapid demographic growth. It was dominated by the expansion of commercial and industrial capitalism. The South, on the other hand, was primarily agricultural, focusing largely on cotton production, which it then shipped to the North as it lacked good ports for trade. The southern economy was heavily reliant on its cotton trade and was controlled by an elite class of plantation owners who depended on slavery for their wealth. In contrast, there was the West. 2 settlers, and the American continent still appeared largely uncolonized. And despite the presence of numerous indigenous nations, often referred to as Indian nations, the West was viewed as empty land waiting to be conquered. And during this period, the West had settlers where they were moving, and it was not yet the far west of cowboys. It resembled what we now call the Midwest, where the open spaces where settlers, mostly farmers, arrived to find abundant land available for the taking. And the U.S. government even offered free land. So if you arrived, built your log cabin, and began farming, the land came at no cost. Always, if you survived the natives' raids that would just unfortunately killed many of the new pioneers that arrived there. And this situation led to a highly egalitarian society overall in America, where the West was primarily an individualistic and agricultural society. Its farming roots explain why, for a long time, the West and the South were allies. Both regions shared common interests, emphasizing agriculture over industrialization, and both were eager for territorial expansion. For the United States, this territorial expansion was crucial for accommodating the waves of immigrants arriving and moving westward. So southern plantation owners were particularly interested in expanding their agricultural economy into new territories, looking to cultivate more land for cotton and other crops. Now, the West is vast, but we must also consider the entire Southwest. The war with Mexico in 1848 was a crucial turning point in U.S. history. Many people might only remember the Battle of the Alamo or David Crockett from Hollywood films, but the 1848 was significant because it allowed the U.S. to acquire vast territories, including Texas, New Mexico, and California. This conflict was driven by interest of southern plantation owners and western settlers, who were politically allied and represented by a party that still exists today, the Democratic Party. In the 19th century, the Democratic Party represented both southern plantation owners and small farmers in the West. However, by the mid-1800s, this coalition began to face challenges. Northern industrialists were growing more influential and pursued policies that favored their industrial interests over agricultural needs. This shift highlighted the reality that a single economic policy could no longer benefit everyone, making a political confrontation inevitable. So initially, no one envisioned anything beyond a political clash. However, the conflict became unavoidable when northern industrialists began to demand tariffs. Similar to today's debates on tariffs on China on imported goods, these tariffs would benefit the American industry by making imported goods from places like England more expensive, thereby encouraging local consumers to purchase American-made products. As a result, the push for protecting tariffs intensified. On the other hand, southern plantation owners were strongly opposed to tariffs. Their economy relied heavily on exporting cotton, and tariffs could provide their main trading partner, England, which might retaliate by imposing its own tariffs on American cotton. Where this may seem like a typical economic conflict found in advanced nation, it presented a deeper divide that threatened the unity of the United States. Every time the industrial lobby in Washington advocated for policies like tariffs that favored their interests, someone from the South would counter that individual states didn't have to comply with Washington's decisions. That means the federal government at the time. After all, the United States was a union of free states, each having voluntarily joined the Federation, and thus they were not necessarily bound to follow federal laws. This issue was significant, similar to today's debates over the European Union and Brexit in the last decade, because it was raised fundamental questions about how far states could go in asserting their rights once they chose to be part of a larger union. In the South, the prevailing sentiment was clear. We do not want laws that go against our interest. If you impose them, we simply won't enforce them. This was the thought at the time. This tension had deep roots, as highlighted by an event from 1832, 30 years before Lincoln's elections. That year, the federal government passed a law imposing higher tariffs, and South Carolina took a radical stand against it. Notably, South Carolina was one of the few southern states where enslaved black people outnumbered white residents. It would later appear as the most extreme state, ultimately becoming the first to declare secession 3 decades later. This conflict signaled the growing divisions within the United States. These issues would eventually lead to the Civil War. The refusal to enforce federal laws was a direct challenge to the authority of the federal government and set a precedent to the broader disputes that would escalate in the years to come. In 1832, South Carolina, faced with a federal law imposing new tariffs, declared that the law was null and void. The state claimed the right to nullify Washington's laws. The federal government, creating a fierce political debate known in history as the nullification crisis. For the first time, a serious discussion began about what the United States truly was, a union of states or something more centralized. At the forefront of this debate was one of America's great politicians of the era, John Calhoun, an intellectual of immense depth and faithful defender of slavery, which he believed was the only system capable of sustaining the South's way of life. During the nullification crisis, John Calhoun, speaking on behalf of the South, declared that while the states had united, each state retained its full sovereignty. According to Calhoun, the states were the true sovereign entities, and the federal government in Washington was merely their agent. He argued that states had no obligation to obey the federal government, as such obedience might be necessary in nations with a unified national interest. However, Calhoun believed that the United States was different. He explicitly stated, "We're not a nation, but a union, a confederation of equal and sovereign states." In contrast to this view, the ideologues of the North argued that the United States was, in fact, a nation, that the laws of a nation must apply equally to all its parts. Well, looking back, it's easy to see how Calhoun's argument, though clear and well-reasoned, clashed with the prevailing spirit of the 19th century. During that era, the dominant force was the idea of nationhood, national unity, and the sacred interest of the nation. To claim that we are not a nation was a remarkably unsettling position at the time, and it was one that in the long run was likely to lose. In fact, some argue today that the American Civil War was the turning point when this issue was ultimately resolved, transforming the United States into a true nation through force. Now, as long as the political conflict over tariffs continued, the interests of the South and West remained somewhat aligned. Both were agricultural regions, with farmers on either side. However, what ultimately broke this grand alliance was the massive expansion of the United States during 1840s and 1850s. The U.S. acquired vast new territories conquered from Mexico and continued its expansion, reaching all the way to the Pacific Ocean. By the late 1840s, the gold rush had begun in California, marking the dawn of a new era. This was no longer just about the West. It was the far West, the more distant frontier, characterized by wars against Native American tribes, vast plains, and the iconic wagon trains of settlers pushing ever further westward, laying the foundations of the great American myths of the frontier. So if you want to know something more about it, at least visually and in the arts, there is this TV show called, I think it's 1892, produced by Taylor Sheridan. I really encourage you to watch that. He gives you the grim reality of the sacrifices that the first pioneers with these wagons actually going across the Midwest plains and just heading westward, how hard it was for them to do so, and how very few of them actually were able to settle in those areas. The relentless push westward represented not only geographic expansion, but also the unfolding vision of a country rich with possibility, an America full of potential. However, there was a problem. The way the United States expanded westward followed a specific procedure. The West was seen as empty and belonging to no one, despite the fact that it was home to the Native Americans, who were largely ignored in this process. Additionally, it was claimed from Mexico, which was portrayed as the enemy, allowing the U.S. to take what it wanted after defeating them. When a certain area, perhaps as large as the entire European country, had only a few thousands of white settlers, they could request to be recognized as a U.S. territory. This wasn't full statehood yet, it was just an intermediate step. After a few more years, as the white population continued to grow, they could officially establish a state. And through this process, the United States consistently added new states expanding its borders and political power across the continent. Well, as you might probably know, because you studied in school, initially the stars of the US flag represented the 13 colonies that rebelled against England. Over time, as new states were created, the flag grew to include 50 stars, as we know today, one for each state. However, there was a problem. The United States was divided between states where slavery was legal and those where it was prohibited. A dividing line known as the Mason-Dixon line ran east to west, separating the northern states where slavery had been abolished from the southern states where it persisted. To clarify, slavery was initially legal throughout the entire country, including the North and New England. However, it never really took hold in the North because it was not practical in an economy driven by commerce, shipping, and industry. In the large plantations of the South, slave labor was essential. The reason why the North eventually abolished slavery are more complex than we might think, but we'll set that aside for now. But one of the many reasons that struck me the most and that I really find reasonable for the abolition of slavery in the North, other than is morally wrong, the abolition of slavery in the North was that to workers and small farmers, slavery was a threat to their livelihoods and economic opportunity. They believed in a free labor ideology, which held that individuals should be able to work for wages and have the opportunity to own land or businesses. And to this point, slavery was seen as undermining to these ideals by creating an unfair, exploitative system that degraded the value of free labor. The main issues emerged when it came to deciding whether a new territory and eventually a new state would allow slavery. Southern leaders were adamant that new territories and states should allow slavery. Their vision was to expand westward, bringing slaves with them, buying more land, establishing new plantations, and extending the southern way of life across the continent. If slavery were prohibited in these new states, only northern farmers would be able to move there and work. For the southern states, it was crucial that slavery be allowed in the new territories. After the conquest of Texas, taken from Mexico, and here there's an important detail to note, the Mexicans had outlawed slavery. When the Americans took over Texas, they reintroduced slavery, a move driven by the southern elites who held power at the time. The southern elites needed the new states to be slaveholding because it was becoming increasingly clear that there were two opposing blocks: the interest of the industrial and commercial states, primarily in the north, and those of the agricultural states that relied on slavery, primarily in the south. These competing interests played out in Washington, and a key part of the political mechanisms was in the Senate. As you may know, the U.S. Senate is a remarkable institution, even today, because it operates without regard to a state's population size. Because each state, whether small, with just 500,000 people, or as large as California, with about 20 million people, can send 2 senators to Washington, numbering them to 100. This meant that if there was a block of slaveholding states at the time, the South needed as many slave states as possible. Each new slave state sent 2 senators to Washington, strengthening their influence. On the contrary, every new state that banned slavery sent 2 senators who would support the opposing side. This created a surreal situation where the balance of power in the Senate hinged on the number of slaves and free states. Now, at the party level, there is something that we should mention. During the 19th century, particularly leading up to the Civil War, many southern states were aligned with the Democratic Party, which was predominantly pro-slavery at the time. The Democratic Party, which emerged from the Democratic Republican Party in the early 19th century, became the primary political party of the South. In the mid-1800s, it had solidified its support for states' rights and the expansion of slavery into new territories. Now, let me explain the issue that emerged when a new state was being created. In 1820, Missouri was being formed in the West, and for the first time, a significant conflict developed over whether slavery should be permitted in that state. Ultimately, the southern states succeeded in their efforts, and Missouri was admitted as a state where slavery was allowed. To balance the situation for the North, a northern state was created by carving out a portion of Massachusetts. This new state, Maine, had previously been an independent colony and then part of Massachusetts. Now, it became its own state where slavery was banned, adding 2 more senators in Washington to represent northern interests. When the War in Mexico began, the issue of slavery resurfaced. Interestingly, years before the war even started, leaders in Washington anticipated that it would occur. They were confident in a victory that would lead to the acquisition of vast new territories. By 1846, just 2 years before the war, debates were already intensifying in Washington over whether slavery would be permitted in these new lands. In that same year, Senator Thomas from Georgia, a southern state, declared in the Senate, "Before the living God, if you pass laws that seek to drive us out of Texas and New Mexico," referring to the possibility that slavery could be banned and southern plantation owners wouldn't be able to expand their operation in those areas. "If you try to drive us out of Texas and New Mexico, I am for secession." The statement came in 1846. It would still take 15 years until the actual secession, and Senator Thomas would later become a general in the Southern Army. After the South's defeat, he moved to Europe, but quickly returned to reclaim his position as the most influential politician in Georgia. However, that's another story. The conquest of Mexico raised significant issues, ultimately resulting in a compromise. Slavery would be permitted in Texas, while it would be banned in New Mexico. California, however, remained undecided. During this debate, a major political shift occurred. While southern plantation owners and western settlers had previously allied in support of allowing slavery in the new territories, the settlers began to disagree on this issue. Many of these settlers were small farmers who did not own slaves and saw no need for them. They questioned why they should cater to the interest of southern plantation owners by allowing slavery in their new territories. Additionally, the rapidly developing economy of the American West in the 1840s and 1850s became increasingly linked to the North, particularly with the expansion of railroads connecting these regions. The railroads in the United States primarily ran from east to west, serving as connections that linked the industrial North and its bustling ports to the agricultural West. Thanks to these railroads, grain and meat from the West no longer flowed to New Orleans, the southern port where goods arrived via the Mississippi River on floatboats. Instead, products from the West were now being transported east to cities like Boston and New York by rail. The industrial North was producing agricultural machinery that the southern plantations, relying on slave labor for cotton production, had little interest in. No one was eager to invest in mechanization when work could be done by hand. In contrast, small independent farmers in the West eagerly purchased new automatic threshers. As a result, new cities emerged in the Midwest, rapidly evolving into big cities. Chicago, for instance, transformed into a major city in just a few decades, becoming known for its stockyards and canned meat factories. The control of these industries would later form the basis of Al Capone's empire 60 years later. This growing economy network served as a catalyst, connecting the agricultural West to the industry and ports of the North, while emphasizing the South's isolation from the rest of the country. This isolation fueled a growing debate over whether slavery was truly the root cause of the American Civil War. While it's undeniable that slavery was a central issue, we must also acknowledge the complexity surrounding this situation. In fact, slavery was a primary reason why the United States ultimately split apart. The most perceptive minds had been predicting this for a long time, as early as 1832. Alexis de Tocqueville was a great French traveler and keen observer of American society, and he warned that the most terrible of all evils threatening the future of the United States arises from the presence of blacks in their land. Thus, while slavery was indeed a critical factor, it's essential not to reduce this issue to a simplistic moral narrative, pitting the good abolitionists against the bad slaveholders. This issue at hand revolves around the dominance of one sector over another, other than, of course, the terrible outcomes that slavery brought on the black populations at the time. It was morally wrong. The North had abolished slavery, but it's important to clarify that among the educated elites in the North, similar to their European counterparts in the 18th century, there was a discourse of the immorality of slavery and the necessity of its abolition. However, these discussions were primarily confined to the elite and had little impact on the broader public opinion in the North and the West. The North abolished slavery primarily because its economic system relied on the labor of workers and sailors, who did not want to face competition from enslaved individuals. They were concerned that slave owners would utilize enslaved labor, thereby undermining the bargaining power of white workers. And this perspective is not mine alone. It's echoed by John Adams, the second president of the United States, and a Northerner who noted in the early 1800s that Massachusetts had abolished slavery. Now, he argued that the true cause of the abolition was the increasing number of white workers who were unwilling to allow the wealthy to resort to these competitors of darker skin. He warned that if slave owners were legally permitted to keep slaves, the common people would react violently against both the enslaved individuals and potentially their owners. This illustrates how the second president viewed the motivations behind the northern states' decisions to abolish slavery. And furthermore, the fact that these motivations were not humanitarian is evidenced by the reality that many northern states, like New York, as well as almost all the new states in the West, had laws that denied voting rights for free blacks. They prohibited black individuals from attending school, serving in juries, or intermarrying with whites. In some cases, states went as far as to ban free blacks from residing within their own borders. For instance, Lincoln's own state had a law prohibiting the entry of any free black person who was not already a resident. In other words, while those who were already present could not be expelled, there was a desire to prevent any further immigration. On the other hand, in the South, at the beginning of the 19th century, serious discussion about abolishing slavery were taking place. Among the educated elite, there was indeed a moral impact and a growing belief that slavery was an archaic system that was not economically viable. This led to a debate in the South about whether it might be better to abolish slavery altogether, and particularly in the early 1800s. A decision that was made to abolish the slave trade, meaning that while the enslaved individuals already present would remain, it was deemed inhumane to continue capturing more. The abolition of the slave trade was enacted in Washington under President Thomas Jefferson, a Southern slave owner who believed that slavery would eventually be overcome. He thought it wise to prevent its expansion. In the South, concerns grew about the increasing number of enslaved individuals, leading some to draft codes to regulate their status. By 1860, the black population in the United States reached 4.5 million, of which 4 million were enslaved. About 8% of the American families in the South owned slaves. And when considering the total U.S. population, slave owners represented an even small percentage, and that is approximately 1.25%. During the time of the American Revolution, many in the South argued that slavery was an outdated and immoral practice that needed to be abolished. George Washington, the first president and a prominent planter from Virginia who owned 200 slaves, publicly expressed his revulsions towards slavery. Many leading Southern politicians echoed these sentiments as well, openly stating that this slavery was an abominable practice and a cancer on society. In 1832, a pivotal year when the Virginia Assembly, the most influential legislature in the South, debated a motion to abolish slavery, the proposal narrowly failed to pass, while there was a general agreement on the eventual need to move beyond slavery. The practical challenges of doing so were daunting at the time. Enslaved people represented a significant capital investment. One could not simply take away someone's property without compensation, but where would the money come from? Moreover, once freed, what would happen to the black population? The debate surrounding this issue was complex, and few believed that freed black individuals could coexist as citizens alongside whites. There was discussion about sending them elsewhere. And in the early decades of the 1800s, as conversations about the abolition of slavery gained momentum in the South, various societies emerged advocating for the resettlement of free blacks to Africa. These humanitarian organizations raised funds to facilitate such relocations. In the early 1820s, under President James Monroe, who was himself a slave owner, the United States established a colony in Africa, purchasing a vast territory that they named Liberia. This initiative aimed to facilitate the relocation of freed black Americans back to Africa. And the capital of Liberia was named Monrovia, in honor of President Monroe, a proponent of this resettlement effort. Over the decades, approximately 15,000 to 20,000 free blacks were sent to Liberia, where they sought to replicate the plantation economy they had known in the United States, focusing on cash crops like rubber and palm oil. Upon the arrival, the new settlers primarily freed African Americans, known as Liberians, encountered various indigenous groups, each with its own social structures and traditions. However, the Liberians imposed their authority over the local population, often coercing or enslaving indigenous individuals to support their plantation economy. This exploitation manifested in various forms, including forced labor, where indigenous people were compelled to work under harsh conditions without compensation. The Liberians viewed themselves as culturally superior to the indigenous population, which facilitated their justification for enslavement and exploitation. They enacted laws that marginalized the indigenous peoples, limiting their rights and reinforcing social and economic inequalities. This created a class system that favored the Liberians, further entrenching divisions within the Liberian society. The practices of Liberians had profound impacts on Liberia's social structures, leading to tensions and conflict between the two groups. This dynamic laid the groundwork for civil unrest and conflict that plagued Liberia in the later 20th century, revealing the complexities and contradictions that were inherent in the settlers' attempts to recreate their societal ideas in a new land. The key point is that while these views were common in the South during the early 1800s, by the time of Abraham Lincoln's election in 1860, the situation had changed dramatically. No Southern politician would dare to suggest that slavery should be abolished or call it immoral, as the political and social climate had shifted. This change was driven largely by economic factors. showing how economic interest can shape public opinion and collective beliefs. In the early 1800s, the Southern economy was not particularly affluent. It revolved around sugarcane, tobacco, and cotton, but profits were modest. Many argued that slavery was not a sustainable economic system. However, the Industrial Revolution changed everything. The production of cotton using slave labor became a lucrative enterprise. As a result, fewer voices called for the abolition of slavery. Instead, they emphasized its profitability. The numbers spoke for themselves. Slavery was productive and profits soared. The value of slaves rose dramatically. By the onset of the Civil War, an enslaved person could be valued around $1,000, an immense sum at the time when a laborer earned only $8 per month. This outcome demonstrated that the slavery system was not, after all, archaic or outdated. On the contrary, it was a system that ensured enormous profits. Additionally, there was another reason why the discourse around abolishing slavery began to fade in the South. Well, ideological factors. This situation underscores the power of ideology and how it can blind individuals who are taken too seriously, deepening divisions between opposing sides. A significant development after the 1820s and into the 1830s was the rise of abolitionism, a religious movement rooted in Puritan values that gained momentum in the North. Abolitionists condemned slavery on moral grounds and increasingly called for its immediate end, pushing for urgent action without compromise. Abolitionists argued that slavery was a disgrace, claiming that slave owners had made a pact with the devil and were destined to burn in hell. In their view, this made slaveholders unworthy of respect in a Christian nation, as their actions were seen as morally corrupt and irredeemable in the eyes of God. The abolitionist movement became a significant force in public opinion, particularly among the educated elite in the North, during the 1830s and 1840s. However, it never fully gained widespread support among the general population. As a result, Southern politicians began to feel increasingly threatened by the radical tone of abolitionism. This shift in rhetoric made it impossible for Southern leaders to maintain their earlier stances, which had once acknowledged the possibility of gradually moving away from slavery. For example, a politician who had voted to abolish slavery in Virginia in 1832 later became governor of the state, but avoided discussing the issue of abolition, where a northern friend asked him why he no longer addressed the topic. He replied, "I haven't changed my mind, but your abolitionists have made it a forbidden topic. Discussing opposition to slavery is political suicide in the South." Well, in the years leading up to the Civil War, the southern states started to see themselves as a separate part of the country, convinced that their interests clashed with those in the North. At the heart of this belief was slavery, which they felt they had to protect at all costs. They feared that without it, their way of life would fade away, leaving them a small minority with serious consequences for their society. As tensions escalated, Southern thinkers and leaders shifted from merely discussing slavery to actively defending it. The discourse around slavery in 1830s and 40s and 50s transformed dramatically. A range of voices emerged: politicians, philosophers, theologians, and Southern preachers, all arguing that slavery was not just acceptable, but sacred. They turned to the Bible for validation, constructing arguments to justify their stance. But you can find any reasons pro or against something with the Bible, because you can just highlight particular passages that will reinforce your idea. Therefore, you can make something more acceptable. One particularly bold claim was, "Do you really think Northern workers are better off? Up north, they work in terrible conditions, not just for a few cents. We treat our slaves well, and they're happy. Well, this argument aimed to contrast the harsh conditions of northern industrial workers with the supposedly benevolent treatment of enslaved people in the South. These justifications revealed a deeply entrenched belief system that sought to preserve a way of life increasing under fire from critics. One notable quote from a speech of the era proclaimed, "Our slaves are happy and satisfied, content and utterly incapable, given their intellectual inferiority, of causing us the slightest problem. They are an inferior race. Did you want to send them back to Africa, to paganism and superstition? Let's keep them here. They enjoy all the benefits of civilization and the Christian religion." According to this viewpoint, it was obvious that they had to be slaves. So as you can see, you can find thousands of reasons why people should be enslaved in that point. And they even found their own moral justifications from it by claiming that slaves would benefit from a society in the United States of the time compared to going back to paganism back into Africa. But I guess there would be a difference between being maltreated, malnourished, and chained compared to living free in their own homeland. Which one would you choose? The idea that enslaved people could govern themselves was met with derision. Don't make me laugh. Everyone in the United States, mind you, agrees that races exist and that they are divided into superior races and inferior races, more evolved races and more primitive races, some of which may one day reach our level, but for now they have not, of course, because they need to fulfill our needs in the southern plantations. That is why. Well, the discourse in the South often took on an alarmist tone. If you free them, you'll see anarchy. They will start stealing and killing. We'll have to exterminate them. Is that what you want? They are so happy as slaves. Well, surprisingly, these arguments struck a chord with many white Southerners, even those who did not own slaves, although only a small percentage of Southern whites owned slaves, and as I mentioned earlier, was 1.25%. Supporters of slavery framed it in a way that made even non-slave owners feel they had a stake in keeping it. They argued that every society needs people to do the hardest, most demanding work. In other societies, they claimed those people are poorly paid and lived in harsh conditions. But in the South, they emphasized no white person had to do heavy labor to live in poverty. By keeping slavery, they ensured that these burdens fell only on the enslaved black populations, protecting the status and livelihood of all white Southerners. This helped unite both slave holders and non-slave holders in support of slavery. Doesn't this sound familiar of our modern world, why we have child labor and cobalt mines in the Congos in order to support our lifestyle with technology, while we export slave labor for a few dollars a day in other parts of the country, and we're not ashamed by it because it's not in front of our eyes. And while corporations might just make justifications for it because they show off every year with a new device, while away from the horrors and the enslavement of these people working in third world countries and these kids, or making t-shirts for big brands in East Asia. Doesn't that resound familiar to you? But somehow we are shielded from that, or we willingly neglect that part because we want our shiny objects in front of us. Something to make you think about, something for you to ponder. Well, in this type of society, all whites are free and equal. This is democracy to them. They have a system where all whites stand on equal footing because another race handles the dirty work. This creates the illusion that poor whites believe slavery is the key to the American dream of freedom and equality. For slave owners, this meant that the South was secure from the other nightmares spreading throughout the world in the mid-1800s, that is, class struggle. In Europe, there were ongoing discussions about exploited workers, their dissatisfaction, strikes, and the threats of revolution. The specter of communism, as articulated by Marx and Engels in 1848, loomed large over the continent. However, in the South, this problem didn't exist. All whites were seen as happy and satisfied. Pro-slavery Senator James Henry Hammond described the situation in the South just 4 years before the Civil War as one of stability, progress, order, peace, satisfaction, and prosperity. He claimed that in their vast territory, they didn't even need a single soldier to defend society, asserting that there was no desire for radical change anywhere. The South felt strong, and this optimism led to an extremist minority that sought further expansion. Having recently defeated Mexico, they believed it was time to conquer Cuba and extend into South America, opening new territories for plantations and slavery. A movement emerged in the South to reopen the African slave trade, which Thomas Jefferson had abolished 50 years earlier. By the late 1850s, Maxie Gregg, a representative in the South Carolina legislature, proposed a motion to reinstate the slave trade. However, this motion was ultimately rejected. Gregg would later become a Confederate general and was killed at the Battle of Fredericksburg in 1862. Despite this setback, the South felt strong and was ready to go to battle to defend its interest, especially since cotton seemed like a surefire guarantee for prosperity. The governor of South Carolina emphasized the importance of cotton to the U.S. Senate, declaring, "You will not wage war against cotton. No power on earth dares to do so. Cotton is everything." Well, this slogan echoed through Southern newspapers among politicians, reinforcing their confidence. In response, Northern public opinion began to shift with increasing alarm. What do these slaveholders want? What is this all about? They aim to expand their influence across the United States, even reaching into the North. Slave owners worked to spread the ideas in northern states, fueling fears about a so-called slave power conspiracy. We all know how newspapers can label certain groups in public discourse, terms we often repeat without thinking, such as the sovereign or the common people. Once the concept of slave power emerged, it quickly took hold. Northerners began to feel a sense of fear, perceiving Southern planters as an arrogant power group conspiring to dominate the nation. This narrative shaped public opinion and conditioned both Northerners and Southerners to view themselves as two distinct nations. For Southerners, the North represented disorder, foreign immigration, smoky cities, working-class misery, hypocritical Puritanism, and the ugly dominance of money. Conversely, Northerners viewed the South as a place of backwardness, laziness, immorality, and an obstacle to the nation's progress. It's an us against them. It's pure bipartisanship at this point. Even if the Protestant churches were torn apart, Baptists and Methodists, who held significant sway over public opinion, became divided. Northern Baptists advocated for the abolition of slavery based on their interpretation of the Bible, while Southern Baptists argued that slavery was perfectly justified, also citing Scripture. As Southerners realized that their conflicting interests with the North could no longer be reconciled, they began to consider an alternative strategy. If Northerners gained too much influence in Washington and they found themselves in the minority, they would secede. This idea, which had been proposed years earlier, gained renewed importance. Southerners argued that they were not a single nation, but rather a union of independent states. The theme of states' rights became politically crucial, with South Carolina and Virginia asserting their right as sovereign states to leave the Union if they chose to do so. In 1850, discussions were underway about admitting California and whether or not to allow slavery there. For the first time, there were only 10 years until Lincoln. For the first time, there were only 10 years because from Lincoln's election. And that same year, a convention of delegates from all southern states convened to assess whether Washington's politics aligned in their interest. That is, Washington's meaning the federal government. What could they do? For the first time, several voices emerged saying, "We will leave." It was one thing to voice such thoughts and quite another to seriously consider them. The gap between the two was significant, marking a turning point in Southern sentiment. In the Senate, discussions were underway to find a compromise. The elderly John Calhoun, who was nearing death, put forth a bold proposal, suggesting that the interests of the North and South could never be reconciled, and proposed creating two separate federations, one for the South and one for the North, that would remain connected and friendly toward each other. This radical idea sent shockwaves through the Senate, which was looking for a more acceptable compromise. In the end, it was decided that there would be no slavery in California. The South had to accept this bitter pill, but in return, they gained something they considered fundamental, a federal commitment to hunt down runaway slaves who escaped to the North. Although the escape of slaves was a genuine concern, it had not reached alarming levels yet. Previously, any slave who reached a free state could easily disappear. Now the federal government promised to track them down, allowing federal agents in northern states to pursue and arrest runaway slaves. This development had a negative impact on northern public opinion, as people began to see that slave owners could mobilize federal authorities to hunt down their enslaved people. The notion of slave power became a tangible fear. Northerners worried that Southern slaves, the slave owners, truly intended to dominate over their lives in the North, and using the powers of the federal government. As a result, the abolitionist movement began to gain momentum. More and more people reflected on the morality of slavery and committed themselves to helping escaping slaves. Underground organizations known as the Underground Railroad began to emerge, providing vital support for those seeking freedom. In 1852, a book titled Uncle Tom's Cabin, or Life Among the Lowly, was published and quickly gained popularity for its vivid depiction of life for enslaved people on southern plantations, though it did romanticize some aspects of their experiences. The novel became a bestseller in the North, and while many Northerners still lacked genuine sympathy for black individuals, often preferring not to have black neighbors, the book contributed to a growing belief that slavery was morally wrong and that Southerners were unjust for wanting to maintain the institution. In the mid-1850s, a significant conflict arose over the territory of Kansas, because Kansas was located north on the Mason-Dixon line. Many Northerners assumed that slavery would not be allowed there. However, influenced by a Southern politician, the government decided that the question of slavery in Kansas would be determined by popular sovereignty, meaning that the residents would vote on whether to permit slavery. As a result, both Northerners and Southerners rushed to Kansas to establish a majority. Settlers from the South moved in to support slavery, while those from the North arrived to advocate for abolition. This intense struggle led to violent clashes between the two sides and deepened the national divide over slavery, a period that became known as Bleeding Kansas. As the situation intensified in the West, tensions escalated and violence erupted. Everyone carried a gun, and clashes between pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers became increasingly common. If you recall that movie, Civil War, when the guy asks, "What kind of American are you?" Well, I guess this was really befitting of the times, because what kind of American are you? Are you an abolitionist or are you a pro-slavery settler? Well, this issue became increasingly common, and this deepened the divisions that would soon involve the entire nation. On May 21st, 1866, a gang of Southerners attacked the town of Lawrence, which was populated by Northerners. They looted and destroyed the local printing press, known for its abolitionist stance. Just 4 days later, on May 25th, Northerners retaliated in what became known as the, help me spell this, Potawatomi Massacre. Also, this is also a Native American name. And a group of abolitionists led by the notorious John Brown targeted the home of a Southerner settler along the Potawatomi River. Under the cover of darkness, they seized the father and his 2 sons, took them into the woods, and killed them with swords. Then they moved to the home of a second settler, dragging him outside and stabbing him to death. Finally, they approached a third cabin, interrogated the owner and 3 guests to confirm their identities, and executed one of them in cold blood. Captain John Brown, as he preferred to be called, was a well-known abolitionist and a deeply religious man from the North, who viewed slavery as an absolute evil that needed to be eradicated at all costs. He had sworn his sons to fight to the death for the cause of abolition, and believed he could incite a slave uprising. While he was actively involved in the conflict in Kansas, his journey would soon lead him to new fronts as the nation approached the end of this tumultuous chapter in the American history. An incident like the violence in Kansas naturally triggered public outcry on both sides. Each faction saw only the brutality inflicted by the other, fueling a national conversation about bleeding Kansas. For Northerners, it was a clear sign that slave owners were resorting to murder, while Southerners believed that those damned abolitionists were killing their people. As tensions escalated, a significant legal case emerged in 1857 that would become a flashpoint in the conflict, the Dred Scott case. Dred Scott was an elderly black man who had been enslaved and owned by a military officer. He had lived in several states, including some where slavery was prohibited. After his owner passed away, Dred Scott sued the officer's widow, arguing that he should be considered free because of the years he had spent in free states. The Dred Scott case quickly became a hot potato, bouncing from one court to another until it finally reached the Supreme Court of the United States. As you may know, the Supreme Court holds immense prestige and significant political influence. When the court analyzed the Dred Scott case, it ultimately issued a groundbreaking ruling. First, that Dred Scott was a slave and, not being a citizen, had not right to appeal to federal courts or sue anyone. Second, and even more crucial, is the ruling had far-reaching implications for the future of slavery and civil rights in America. It is true that in earlier times, certain states had been free from slavery due to congressional law. However, the Supreme Court ultimately decided that Congress had no authority to prohibit slavery in any state. Each state was deemed sovereign and could determine its own stance on slavery. Therefore, the previous prohibition of slavery in Illinois, when Dred Scott lived there, was not valid because it was imposed by Congress, not by a local decision. As a result, Dred Scott had no right to claim his freedom. This ruling was monumental, establishing that the federal government in Washington could not prohibit slavery. All individual states held that power. The implications of this decision were explosive, igniting fierce debate across the nation. Then, in 1859, we arrive at the final dramatic episode in the saga. And I know I'm taking some time to get through this, but it's important to grasp the complexity of the history leading up to this moment. In 1859, John Brown re-emerged as a key figure. Having left Kansas, he now aimed to incite a significant slave revolt in the South. To do this, he gathered a group of men and devised a plan to seize a military arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, intending to distribute weapons to enslaved people. Now, this move would set the stage for one of the most pivotal movements in the lead up to the Civil War. In the summer of 1859, John Brown rented a farmhouse near Harper's Ferry in Virginia and slowly gathered his group of men. By October 16, he had around 20 armed followers and launched his plan to seize the nearby federal arsenal, which was only lightly defended. His goal was to use the captured weapons to arm enslaved people in the area, sparking a widespread uprising. After taking control of the arsenal, Brown sent messengers to surrounding plantations, urging enslaved individuals to join the rebellion. Despite these efforts, no one responded. Soon, local militias arrived, and President Buchanan dispatched the U.S. Marines from Washington to put down the raid. The Marines were led by a colonel who would later become one of the most famous figures of the Civil War, Robert E. Lee, future commander of the Confederate Army. In the ensuing firefight, most of Brown's men were killed and Brown himself was captured. John Brown was quickly put on trial, convicted, and sentenced to death. On December 2nd, 1859, he was hanged. Before his execution, Brown left behind a powerful final message. I, John Brown, am now fully convinced that the crimes of this guilty country will never be expiated except with blood. His raid and these final words echoed throughout the nation, further deepening the divide between North and South. The death of John Brown quickly became legendary, especially in the North, where he was seen as a martyr. On the day of his execution, church bells tolled in his honor, and cannon salutes were fired in his memory. His story gave rise to a song that resonated with many. As 1860 approached, the country faced a critical election, and a new political force emerged to challenge the long-dominant Democratic Party. The new party recognized a crucial shift. The West, which had previously aligned with the South, now had growing economic and social ties with the North. As a result, the potential for breaking the traditional alliance between the South and the West was clear. The party's goal was to unite Northern industrialists with Western settlers, sidelining with the Southern slaveholding interest that had long held sway. The party positioned itself with progressive and egalitarian, and adopting the name of Republican Party. Interestingly, the roles of the Republicans and Democratic parties today are almost the opposites of what they represented back then. In the 1860s, the Republican Party sensed a unique opportunity. The Democratic Party was split between two candidates, with an independent contender and also that was also in the race. This division gave the Republican a clear path to victory for the Republicans if they could win over the West. To strengthen their appeal to Western voters, they chose a candidate from that region, Abraham Lincoln. The strategy set the stage for one of the most significant elections in American history. Abraham Lincoln, though a lawyer and seasoned politician with experience in both Illinois and Washington, was also seen as a man of the people and a frontierman raised in a log cabin who could genuinely understand the common settler. This image helped him connect with Western voters. Although Lincoln was a professional politician, he was known for his moderate views, particularly on the contentious issue of slavery. When Lincoln ran for president in 1860, the Republican platform took a cautious stance on slavery. While abolitionist ideas were spreading, they hadn't yet gained widespread support across the country. The Republican Party understood that taking an extreme anti-slavery position would alienate many voters. So they focused instead on preventing the expansion of slavery into new territories rather than pushing for its immediate abolition. A clear example of the complicated attitudes towards slavery at the time can be found in Kansas. The violent struggle in Bleeding Kansas ended with the anti-slavery side victorious, and Kansas became a free state. However, its new constitution went so far as to prohibit any black person, free or enslaved, from entering the state. For many, the push to ban slavery was less about moral opposition and more about preventing competition from black individuals, highlighting the complex and often contradictory beliefs surrounding race and slavery during this period. Lincoln was chosen as the Republican candidate, in part because he was seen as a moderate, someone who wouldn't alarm the South too much, unlike the more radical abolitionists. Lincoln had never advocated for the immediate end of slavery. He recognized that slavery was a deep and complex problem, but he was candid about not knowing the best solution. In a speech in Illinois, Lincoln admitted, "Even if I had all the existing powers on this earth, I would not know what to do with slavery. My first impulse would be to free all the slaves and send them back to Africa. However, upon reflection, I would think that this is something that may be done in the long term, but in the short term, what should be done? Free them and give them social and political equality? My personal feelings do not allow this, and the great mass of the white population does not want it either." Lincoln's stance reflected the broader sentiment of the time, that many Northerners, while uncomfortable with slavery, were not prepared to embrace full equality for black people. As a politician, Lincoln's platform emphasized that he had no intention of interfering with slavery when it already existed. He believed that each state had the right to make its own decision about slavery. However, the Republican Party's platform made it clear that the South's rhetoric about states' rights and secession had to stop. The federal government, they argued, was supreme over individual states, and no states had the right to nullify federal laws or threaten secession. From an economic and political perspective, secession was viewed as treasonous. Lincoln's message was firm. While slavery might not be touched for now, the Union was not up for debate. The program put forward by Lincoln and the Northern industrialists was ambitious, calling for significant investments in infrastructure, particularly railroads, to expand westwards. This did not sit well with the South, which saw Lincoln as a threat to their way of life and interest. Southern politicians depicted Lincoln as a radical abolitionist, even associating him with John Brown, who was widely despised in the South after his failed attempt to incite a slave rebellion. In the November election of 1860, Lincoln won the presidency, but his support came solely from the North and the West, receiving 0 votes in 9 southern states. This was largely due to the unique nature of voting at the time. Voting was not a secret process, as it is today. It was public. People had to write their own ballots and deliver them personally. In the South, no printer would ever produce ballots with Lincoln's name, and anyone attempting to vote for him would likely face serious threats from their neighbors. This is why Lincoln received no votes in places like Alabama, yet still won the election. Lincoln's election triggered an immediate reaction. On December 20th, 1860, South Carolina declared its independence from the Union. Before Lincoln's inauguration in March 1861, 6 more southern states followed suit, and together they formed the Confederate States of America, making the first formal steps toward the Civil War. In his inaugural address on March 4, 1861, Abraham Lincoln made a final appeal to the nation, attempting to ease Southern fears and prevent the looming conflict. He clarified that he had no intention of abolishing slavery while it already existed, acknowledging both legal limitation and his personal lack of desire to interfere with the institution. Lincoln stated, "I have no intention of interfering with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. I do not believe I have the legal right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so." However, he firmly opposed secession, which was already in progress by the time. Lincoln underscored his belief that the Union was perpetual and that no state had the legal right to secede unilaterally. He claims, "I believe that based on the Constitution, the union of these states is eternal, and no state can legally exit the Union on its own accord." According to him, secession was not a lawful act, but a rebellion, and he was resolute in his commitment to maintain the Union. He says, "For all I can do, I will ensure that the laws of the Union are faithfully applied in all states." In a powerful warning against the dangers of secession, Lincoln compared it to anarchy. He emphasized that the majority's will, governed by constitutional checks and balances, was the foundation of democracy. He argued that rejecting the system would lead to either chaos or tyranny. He claims, "The idea of secession is the essence of anarchy. The power of the majority, kept in check by a series of constitutional checks and balances, is the only true sovereign of a free people. Anyone who rejects the government of the majority must inevitably fall into anarchy or despotism." With these words, Lincoln expressed both his deep commitment to preserving the Union and his opposition to the radical step of secession, which he viewed as a fundamental threat to the stability of and ideals of American democracy. However, despite his conciliatory tone, tensions were too high, and the country stood on the brink of civil war. Lincoln's inaugural address demonstrated a deep understanding that the North and South were too interconnected to simply separate from one another. Unlike the divorced couple who can live apart, he stressed that the regions of the country were too intertwined to be divided by any insurmountable wall. This metaphor was particularly relevant, especially in a time when building walls as a political solution might seem plausible. Throughout his speech, Lincoln addressed the South directly, urging them to reconsider their decision to secede and to avoid war. He stated, "In your hands, my compatriots, not in my hands, lies the dramatic question of the Civil War." He reassured them that the federal government would not act aggressively, emphasizing that conflict would not arise if you are the aggressors. So Lincoln's rhetoric was aimed at reconciliation, not hostility. He concluded his address with a heartfelt appeal, addressing his hope for unity. "We're not enemies, but friends. We should not be enemies." However, despite Lincoln's attempts at peace, the southern states responded by seizing federal properties within their borders, including military installation. In Charleston, South Carolina, a pivotal moment unfolded when a small federal garrison refused to surrender Fort Sumter. On April 12, 1861, authorities in South Carolina fired upon Fort Sumter, forcing its surrender the following day. This act of aggression marked the beginning of the American Civil War. In response, President Lincoln requested full authority to raise an army, initially to retake Fort Sumter, enlisting 70,000 men for what many believed would be a brief conflict. However, this was just the beginning of a war that would last 4 years, resulting in profound transformations in American society. 4 years after Fort Sumter fell, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated on April 15, 1865, and the Civil War came to an end. Slavery was abolished across the United States, but this was achieved without reparations, compensations, or substantial debate about the future for formerly enslaved people. The only significant decision made was to grant black individuals the same rights as other citizens. This monumental social change occurred suddenly in a society largely unprepared for it, both in the South, where slavery had been deeply entrenched, and in the North, where many white Americans still opposed true equality. The legacy of this unexpected progress continues to be deeply felt today as the country grapples with its ongoing consequences. Well, this is it's very interesting to observe how human nature behaves in the face of prosperity and personal interest of power. Because what do we see here is like a preponderance of the few plantation owners in the South who wanted to hold economic powers for the longest times, they being a minority in the slaveholding business, only because they would not believe in industrializing their agricultural society and actually engaging machines in doing the same work the slaves were doing, because it was far more profitable for them to do so. At the same time, in the North, there was that kind of skepticism toward black individuals because they would not think of them as equals. From what I can think of, without taking away the suffering and the horrors of slavery against African Americans of the time in the 18th century, I believe that we have come really full circle today, but we are in a much better place still through the 20th century, other horrors and discrimination that African Americans suffered. But this was not merely, even the topic of slavery is central in this context, is also financial reasons, but at the basis of it, it's the aspect of a population, because they did not even know what to do with all these millions of people that they imported from Africa. And this was for sure a bleak, dark moment in American history. Even if you say it's for he went on for some time. And the thing that I wanted to say, even looking at the horror, recognizing the suffering of it, many people today try to recognize this moment in American history as the moment as portraying all slavery in the world perpetrated by white people. And that is a false assumption, because many people do not know how history, well, slavery existed for thousands of years, and it was even before any white people could actually practice it, because it was practiced all over the world. Well, in Africa, when the Portuguese and the Spanish went to load slaves in West Africa, well, what do you think? Who would round up the slaves to be brought on these ships in inhumane conditions? It was local indigenous population. They were warring and enslaving each other way before the Europeans came. And they were grouping these people to be shipped and be paid by the Europeans to purchase them. So it was something that was done already there. And if you go back in history, there is many instances. And even today, the world is full of... There's still, in the Middle East today exists, I don't know, in the world I was reading, it was 40 million slaves today. So it's still an ongoing debate. It's not something that was only, as many people want to emphasize, mainly from a leftist agenda, that the source of slavery was the fault of the white man. Well, that is not correct. It has been a sin of American history, but it did not happen. It was not exclusive to the Americas. So it was well beyond. It's the history of human nature and the history of war, the history of conquest and carnage that occurred throughout the centuries. The problem is that we try to apply our modern ethical knowledge and ethical moral to the past, but it's not the same. We cannot do so. And because many people in the past thought that those processes, those things were normal and they were not as evolved societally as we are today. So that is really different. And I cannot really fathom, like, imagine to see the parallels with today, the division that we see nowadays. And in Abraham Lincoln's time, that was seen as a pivotal election, the most important election in history. And it really was. If you want to go and look back, it was a new era. It was make it or break it. And eventually, after the war was won by the North, it was really what sealed this union and create this United States to go forward together. So this marks the end of this lesson. If you stuck around for this long, you should be proud of yourself, because you are one person that wants to really go deep and long into knowledge and understand things. With history, as with many other things, there is not right or wrong, black or white, as I always say. There's different motivations, there's different interests that surround a certain issue, and we need to go deep to understand what really happened. Many people want to say North good, South bad, South slavery, North anti-slavery. That's the juice of it, if you want a quick answer, but there is way more into it, of what led to that, of the reasons, why this happened, why that happened. So I just want to leave you with this. Be always critical thinkers, and go deep and look for the evidence, what really happened, because people could propagandize and make a good case for slavery or make a bad case for slavery by using the Bible. And nowadays, people use the Bible to justify their moral, to glorify their moral stance. And you could do the same with many other things. You can make so much more mental gymnastics and call something different, and to make it more acceptable and making widespread, so more people come to you and agree with you and praise your throughout consensus. And that's not the way people should work, I think. So just be critical, always. Well, this is it, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for following and hanging on for this long, and I will see you next time. Bye.